In 1976, a Department of Lands and Survey worker named Jeff Park was clearing a track through the Northland coast when he stopped at a tree he had walked past a dozen times before and realized he could not identify it. It was massive, with a trunk wider than his arm span, bark like flaking armor, and leaves arranged in a way he had never seen on any species he knew from the region. He took a sample and drove it to the nearest herbarium. The botanist who examined it put the sample down and said he needed to make a phone call. The species was Merida sinclairi, the puka, and finding it growing wild in that location was not supposed to be possible. But it was what the botanist said next that stays with anyone who hears the story. He said the tree in the photograph behind him, the one pinned to the wall of his office, a pressed specimen collected in 1832, was the last time anyone had documented the species growing anywhere outside a single set of offshore islands. The coastal Northland population had been considered locally extinct for over a century. There were 3 of them. The response from the New Zealand botanical community was not immediate celebration. It was something closer to alarm because finding 3 surviving trees of any species on the mainland is not a recovery story. It is a countdown with a number attached. 3 trees means 3 lightning strikes away from 0. 3 trees means 1 introduced pathogen from the end. 3 trees means a single fire, a single storm event, a single outbreak of the wrong root fungus introduced on the boot of a single careless visitor, and the mainland population is over. The margin between existence and the past tense is a number you can count on one hand and still have fingers left. Conservation biology has a term for this kind of population. Not rare, not endangered. Functionally extinct in the wild, maintained above 0 only by the continued survival of individuals that are no longer capable of maintaining themselves without some form of ongoing luck or ongoing intervention. The puka on the Northland coast, when it was assessed in the months following Park's report, fit that description precisely. What followed those 3 trees was a rescue effort that became one of the most technically demanding plant recovery programs New Zealand has ever attempted, and it raised a question that plant conservationists are still arguing about today. When a species is reduced to its last individuals, are you saving it, or are you saving a version of it that can no longer save itself? The genetic breadth of a species, accumulated across thousands of generations of variation, selection, and adaptation, cannot be reconstructed from 3 trees. The best a 3-tree rescue program can do is prevent the number from reaching 0 and hope that 0 is the only thing it actually needed to avoid. To understand why finding 3 trees produced that level of alarm, you need to understand what the puka is and what happened to it. Merida sinclairi belongs to the Araliaceae family, the same group that includes ivy and ginseng, but it sits far enough out on its own branch of the family tree that its closest relatives are all in the Pacific Islands. It arrived in New Zealand through bird dispersal, most likely carried by Kararu or some earlier frugivore, at some point in the deep past. On the Poor Knights Islands, a volcanic archipelago off the Northland coast that has been predator-free since humans arrived, the puka thrived. The islands had no rats, no possums, no goats, no deer, no pigs. The puka could set seed, germinate in open ground, establish without being browsed to the root, and grow to a full canopy tree without anything eating it at any stage of its life. On the mainland, none of those conditions existed after Polynesian settlement brought Kiore, and later European settlement brought every subsequent predator. The mainland puka died out so quietly that nobody appears to have noticed the precise moment it stopped existing there. The 1832 specimen was collected, filed, and not thought about again for 144 years. The scale of what had been lost between 1832 and 1976 was not obvious from looking at the Poor Knights population. On the islands, puka was doing what puka is supposed to do. It was dominant in parts of the coastal forest, setting seed, regenerating, providing canopy that supported entire communities of invertebrates and birds. Anyone visiting the Poor Knights without knowing the mainland history could have concluded that the species was secure. What that picture concealed was that the Poor Knights population represented a small fragment of a range that had historically extended across the northern coastline of the North Island. Herbarium specimens collected in the early decades of European settlement document puka from sites as far south as the Coromandel. By the time Park found his 3 trees, those populations were gone. Not reduced. Gone. The 1976 discovery was not the first sign that something was wrong. It was the last sign that something was not yet finished. The 3 trees Jeff Park found were old enough that the botanists who examined them in the weeks following his report could not determine with confidence how old they actually were. The bark and growth form suggested a minimum age of several hundred years. The trees had survived not because the mainland had become safe for puka seedlings. It had not. The seedlings those trees produced would have been browsed by possums and rats as fast as they emerged, and the soil around the base of all 3 trees bore no evidence of any natural regeneration at any point in the living memory of anyone who had worked that land. They had survived as individuals because they were large enough and structured in a way that made them sufficiently inaccessible to climbing browsers to maintain their own canopy through the worst of the predator pressure. But they were not reproducing. They were outlasting. There is a difference between a species that is surviving and a species that is persisting, and the puka on the Northland coast had crossed that line at some point nobody could identify. The first problem the recovery program faced was the same problem that faces almost every last individual rescue operation in New Zealand's conservation history: getting any biological material from those trees into controlled propagation before something happened to them. The trees were on private land. The landowners were cooperative but not in a position to provide the level of biosecurity management the botanists considered necessary. And the trees themselves, while large and structurally robust, were each isolated from the others by enough distance that cross-pollination was unreliable. The puka is dioecious, meaning individual trees are either male or female. Of the 3 surviving mainland trees, the botanical survey that followed Park's initial report eventually determined that 2 were female and 1 was male. That particular configuration was the most important piece of biological information the recovery program had. It meant the genetic material they were working with was already limited, but it also meant that seed production was technically possible if the male tree was healthy enough to produce viable pollen during the same window the female trees were receptive. Puka does not cooperate with artificial pollination. The trees flower on a schedule that does not match the standard growing calendar that horticulturists had developed for related species, and early attempts to time collections around predicted flowering windows produced inconsistent results. The propagation team working through what was then the Department of Lands and Survey, later folded into the Department of Conservation when it was established in 1987, settled on vegetative propagation as the primary route. Cuttings from all 3 trees were taken with as little disturbance to the canopy as possible, treated and placed into mist propagation units at a regional nursery. The results were not straightforward. Merida sinclairi cuttings are notoriously reluctant to root under standard conditions. Early trial batches produced rooting rates low enough that the program's lead horticulturist described the first season as a near failure in a report that circulated internally through the department. The issue was not the cutting material itself. The tissues were healthy. The issue was that the species requires a very specific moisture and temperature combination at the cutting base that differs from conditions that work for most New Zealand native trees, and the team spent 2 full growing seasons adjusting protocols before they arrived at a rooting rate that made mass propagation viable. The eventual protocol that produced reliable results involved a lower rooting medium temperature than standard, a longer misting interval, and the removal of all but the most juvenile leaf material from the cutting before placement. None of those adjustments were based on anything in the published literature on Merida propagation, because there was almost nothing in the published literature on Merida propagation. The team arrived at the working protocol by systematic elimination, discarding each variable that made no difference until what remained was a set of conditions under which cuttings from all 3 trees were rooting at rates between 55 and 70%. Not high by the standards of commercial horticulture, high enough for a program working with material from 3 trees on a mainland where no backup existed. By the mid-1980s, the program had produced enough material from all 3 trees to begin a cautious distribution to botanical gardens and to the Department of Conservation's own nursery reserves. Specimens from the mainland trees were planted at the Auckland Regional Botanic Gardens, at Tain Mahuta Reserve in the Waipua Forest, and at a small number of private conservation properties in Northland where predator control programs were already operating. This was not restoration in the sense of returning the species to its former range. The mainland conditions that had allowed the original trees to establish had not been replicated anywhere. What the distributed trees represented was insurance. Multiple copies of the 3-tree genetic pool, held in separate locations so that no single event could eliminate all the material the program had. What the program did not have and could not have given the genetic starting point was diversity. Every propagule from the 3 mainland trees was genetically derived from only 3 individuals, and those 3 individuals were themselves isolated from the poor knight's population for long enough that there was no certainty about how much variation remained between them. The poor knight's trees, which existed in their hundreds on islands that were formally gazetted as a nature reserve in 1981, and from which all introduced predators had been progressively eliminated, represented the bulk of the species' remaining genetic range. But connecting the mainland propagation program to the poor knight's population raised a different set of questions. Introducing poor knight's genetics to the mainland program would increase diversity, which was a conservation gain. It would also potentially change the character of whatever mainland population eventually established, since the mainland trees had been isolated long enough that any local adaptation they carried, any slight physiological tolerance to the specific conditions of the Northland coast that differentiated them from the island population, would be diluted. Those are not easy calls. They involve a version of the question that all small population plant conservation eventually arrives at. What exactly are you trying to preserve? The genome, the individual, the ecological function, the location. The arguments on both sides of this debate were serious and grounded in real data. The case for introducing poor knight's genetics was straightforward. A species with greater genetic diversity is more resilient to disease, more capable of adapting to changed conditions, and more likely to persist over long time periods without management support. The case for keeping the mainland material isolated was also defensible. The 3 surviving mainland trees had persisted through the worst predator pressure New Zealand's North Island had experienced since European settlement. If they carried any local adaptation, any slight edge in their ability to tolerate browsing pressure or to recruit in the specific soil and canopy conditions of the northern Northland coast, diluting that adaptation with island genetics risked losing something the program could not measure and therefore could not deliberately select for. Neither position was wrong. They were working from different assumptions about what the program was ultimately for. The Department of Conservation's position through the late 1980s and into the 1990s was to keep the mainland program and the island population as separate streams. Mainland material stayed with mainland propagules. Poor knight's seed was used to establish ex situ collections at botanical institutions, but was not crossed into the mainland restoration plantings. That boundary was debated, and it was not universally accepted as the right call, but it held for long enough to allow the mainland-derived material to accumulate in sufficient numbers that the program moved from emergency propagation into the next phase, which was attempting to establish genuinely self-sustaining wild populations outside the 3 original trees. The context for this work matters in a way that is not obvious from the planting program alone. In the early 1990s, New Zealand's approach to mainland predator control was still in its early development phase. The 1080 aerial operation technology that would later make large-scale predator suppression across continuous landscape possible was being refined but was not yet deployed at the frequency or coverage that characterized the programs of the 2000s and 2010s. The Northland sites selected for puka restoration in 1991 were receiving what was then considered intensive management. By later standards, the predator pressure those sites were operating under would be described as moderate at best. The survival rates for individually fenced plantings reflected that reality. Survival inside fenced exclosures was high. Survival among unfenced specimens at the same sites, planted as a comparison set to assess whether the predator control alone was sufficient without physical barriers, was significantly lower and weighted toward larger individuals that had already passed the most vulnerable seedling stage before being placed in the ground. The first trial plantings in areas with active predator control went into the ground in Northland between 1991 and 1994. The locations were selected based on soil type, canopy structure, and proximity to existing puka populations on the islands, which the program modeled as a rough proxy for the habitat conditions the species had historically occupied on the mainland coast. The predator control at the planting sites used first-generation poison bait stations and periodic trapping grids, the tools available at the time, which reduced but did not eliminate the browser pressure that had prevented natural regeneration around the original 3 trees for the previous century. The planted specimens were fenced individually, they were checked on a cycle, And then the program waited for the thing that all restoration planting eventually comes down to, whether the planted individuals would survive long enough to reproduce on their own. This is the part of the story that does not make it into news coverage because it has no obvious moment of resolution and no clear image to attach to. It is 8 years of monitoring reports noting that the planted individuals are alive and growing, then 2 more years of waiting for the first reliable flowering assessment, then a further season to confirm whether the flowers produced are setting viable pollen and viable seed, then the following wet season to check whether any of the seed reached the ground and germinated, then another 12 months to see if the germinated seedling survived its first summer. The entire cycle from planting a cutting to having reasonable confidence that the planted tree is contributing to wild recruitment spans somewhere between 15 and 25 years depending on which site and which individual you are tracking. The people who began the program in the 1980s were not going to be the people who found out whether it worked in any complete sense. That is the kind of commitment that institutional conservation programs are not always structured to sustain. And the fact that this one did reflect something about the specific people who stayed attached to it across the decades. The answer was slow in arriving, which is the nature of working with a large canopy tree. A puka planted as a rooted cutting from a healthy parent stem does not reach reproductive maturity for somewhere between 8 and 15 years depending on site conditions. The program's earliest plantings from the 1991 and 1992 seasons were not checked for reproductive activity until the early 2000s. And the initial surveys found that a portion of the surviving specimens were producing flowers, not all of them. The sex ratio of the planted population did not perfectly replicate the 2-to-1 female-to-male ratio of the source trees, partly because sexing a puka before it flowers is not possible with any method the team had available, and partly because the rooting success rates had differed slightly between cuttings from different parent trees, skewing the propagated numbers in ways that were not apparent until the plants were in the ground and flowering. Where male and female plants had ended up within pollination range of each other, seed production was confirmed. Where the sex ratio or the spacing had produced isolated female trees with no male in the vicinity, the trees were flowering without setting viable seed. Exactly the same dead end the original 3 trees on the mainland had been stuck in for decades. The program responded by mapping the sex of every surviving planted specimen across all the trial sites and strategically transplanting male material into locations where female trees were isolated. It was, in ecological terms, a form of matchmaking at landscape scale, and it was more labor-intensive than anyone had projected when the planting program was first scoped. But by the mid-2000s, a handful of the earliest trial sites were producing documented natural seedling recruitment. Not large numbers, not the kind of numbers that would allow anyone to describe what was happening as a recovered population, but seedlings in the ground under planted puka trees, establishing without human assistance, surviving the first season, the second, and in a small number of cases, recorded through the decade following, reaching a size at which they could plausibly survive a reduction in active management. The 3 original trees are still standing, all 3 of them. The oldest assessments of their condition, conducted at irregular intervals through the Department of Conservation's monitoring program, have described them as structurally stable with no significant decline in canopy health documented in the survey record. They are still the only trees on the mainland that can trace their lineage to a time before the mainland population contracted to nothing. Everything planted in the ground in Northland over the 4 decades since Park's initial report descends from those 3 individuals, or from subsequent mixing with poor Knight's material that the program eventually incorporated after the strict separation policy was revisited in the late 1990s. The question the recovery program set out to answer was whether a species represented by 3 individuals could be brought back to the point of self-sustaining wild reproduction. The honest answer, as of the most recent monitoring data available to researchers working in this area, is that the program has moved the needle without closing the question. There are puka growing in Northland outside the range of the 3 original trees. Some of them are producing seed. Some of that seed is producing seedlings. Whether those seedlings will grow into reproductive adults and whether the cycle will continue through a second generation without ongoing management intervention is something the program is still waiting to find out because the timeline of a large canopy tree does not accommodate impatience. What the program has also demonstrated is something that does not appear in any monitoring report but is present if you look at the whole 40-year arc of the work. The moment of greatest danger for the mainland puka was not 1976 when the 3 trees were found. It was the decades before 1976, when nobody was looking and the number could have dropped from 3 to 2, and then to 1, and then to 0, without triggering any response. The discovery did not create the crisis. It revealed a crisis that had been developing, invisibly, for most of the previous century. The recovery program that followed was not a response to a new problem. It was a very late response to a very old one. That distinction matters because it suggests something uncomfortable about what conservation monitoring is actually for. If a mainland population can decline from whatever it once was to 3 surviving individuals without anyone in the scientific or management community noticing, the problem is not only the predators and the habitat loss. It is also the gap in attention that allowed the decline to proceed unobserved for long enough that 3 trees were all that was left when someone finally stopped and looked. What the program has demonstrated is the more limited but still genuinely significant claim that genetic material from 3 individuals can be kept from disappearing, distributed widely enough to survive a single catastrophic event at any one location, and coaxed back into something that functions like wild reproduction under managed conditions. That is not nothing. The specimens growing in the Auckland Regional Botanic Gardens have produced seed that has been distributed to other collections. The Tane Mahuta plantings have been visited by Kareru documented carrying puka fruit through surveys in the seasons following the restoration planting's first significant fruiting years. The Kareru is the only bird in New Zealand large enough to swallow a puka fruit whole and pass the seed intact, which means the reactivation of that dispersal relationship is not incidental to the recovery program. It is the mechanism by which any self-sustaining wild population would eventually function. A puka that cannot recruit through bird-dispersed seed is a planted tree. A puka whose fruit is being carried by Kareru to new ground outside the planting radius is the beginning of something else. The seed dispersal pathway that the species depends on in its natural state has reactivated itself without any human assistance at least one of the restoration sites in Northland. And that is the data point that matters most to the researchers still tracking the program's long-term trajectory. There is a pressed specimen in the Auckland War Memorial Museum herbarium collection, mounted on thick paper, with a handwritten label in ink dating the collection to 1832. It is the specimen that was already on the wall when Jeff Park's discovery was reported, the last documented evidence of mainland puka before the 3 surviving trees were found. Beside it in the collection, there is now a second specimen, collected in 2019, from a seedling that established naturally under a planted puka tree in a Northland reserve without anyone placing a seed or touching the ground. The label notes the parent tree's provenance. It traces back to a cutting taken from one of the original 3 trees in 1983. The seedling that produced the 2019 specimen germinated on its own, in wild soil, under conditions that have not supported mainland puka germination at any documented point in the previous 187 years. It is not a recovered species. The word recovery implies an endpoint that the puka on the New Zealand mainland has not reached. It is not a resolved story, because the seedlings currently establishing at the Northland restoration sites have not yet produced their own seed, and the question of whether they will do so in sufficient density and distribution to maintain the population without active intervention remains genuinely open. But it is not a countdown anymore either. If a story like this changes how you think about what 3 trees can do when the right people refuse to let them be the last ones, subscribe. One of these goes up every week. Like the video if it was worth your time.